The most powerful message yesterday came less from Canberra but from Washington, where leaving hospital, President Donald Trump declared, "Don't let the virus dominate your life." That this virus has dominated the recent past is a matter of fact. And given where we are at the start of this pandemic, where we were with mounting overseas deaths, open international borders that we then had to close, and little known about the pathogen we were confronted with, no one can blame our governments for acting as they did. What they did in every other jurisdiction outside of Victoria and what they did in Canberra has saved lives and livelihoods. And the cost of all of that was there in black and indeed red ink in last night's budget. But just as President Trump said, don't let this budget, this virus, dominate your life, our challenge here in Australia is to make sure that it doesn't dominate our future. Because none of us should want to be in a world of even higher spending, even higher taxes, ever more debt, and continuing state border closures, however necessary they might have been in the short term at the height of this pandemic. The key features of last night's budget were the bring forwards of personal income tax cuts to increase incentives to work, because tax cuts aren't the government giving money to us. It's us, the taxpayers, keeping more of our money. Never forget that. It's not a gift from government, it's your money. Good too was the increased help for small business, the instant asset write-off, for example, to give them the incentive now in the middle of this recession to invest in new plants and equipment, to upgrade and upskill, to keep money moving in our economy. Given small business generates just under half of Australia's total revenue and employs around 45% of all workers in this country, if we want to get our country up and going again, well, small business is that engine room. Another thing I want to mention here too is this new JobMaker wage subsidy. JobKeeper, as you know, you'll remember that from the start of the pandemic, that was all about keeping people in work. People still there, in work. However, if their hours had been cut or their wages cut at COVID, it kept them in their job. Well, JobMaker is designed for those who might lose their current job and need a new one. And I tell you what, it's far better than just putting these people on the dole. By its very design, JobMaker's set up to get people into work by giving business the incentive to pick them up now and employ them, even though the business itself might only be starting to get back on its feet. Now, the budget papers tell us that close to 500,000 people will benefit from this new subsidy to employers of up to $200 per worker per week. And presumably, one of the key impacts of this policy will be keep the unemployment rate in single digits. Now, I might quibble that it's too heavily focused on the under 35s and not the worrying trend of people in their 40s and 50s losing work out of this pandemic. No doubt that can be improved on. But the idea of a fair income scheme to stop people being consigned to the scrap heap of long-term unemployment and left there, see, that's smart. It's smart and it's humane, because a job means self-worth and dignity as much as anything else. On the big macro numbers, I have to be honest, listening to the Treasurer last night, I almost said to myself, there's a real Labor feel to some of these numbers. A $214 billion deficit, or more than 10% of GDP. That seems Labor to me. And a gross debt heading towards $2 trillion, or well over 50% of GDP by the end of the decade. But here's the difference. The big difference between last night's budget numbers and a Labor budget is that these new measures, the big costs out of last night's budget, well, that's almost all of the tax cuts. So it's more money in your pocket, rather than government spending hikes where they waste what they spend 9 times out of 10 anyway, and they're baked in for decades ahead. Importantly, all of these wage subsidies remain temporary, and there's no commitment to keep the increased dole beyond this year. So, as I said, unlike Labor budgets, this spending is not baked in. That's a critical point a lot of commentators have missed today. Now, as both the PM and the Treasurer have stressed, while this isn't the budget they expected to bring down 7 months ago, it's still very much a budget of Liberal values, because at the heart of centre-right politics is the conviction that strong businesses rather than big government that drives our country's prosperity. Now, like the Great Depression, referenced last night, of course, in the Treasurer's speech, this current slump is not the result of changing economic conditions, but deliberate government policy to keep us safe in a time of pandemic. When it's government restrictions that slow the economy down, it's reasonable to think that the end of government restrictions will help speed things up again. And of course, this is what's now urgently needing to happen right across the country, because only strong economic growth will get us out of this recession, people back into their jobs, help us repay all of this debt and keep the burden of taxes low. Without any more political games of delay, our state borders have got to open up. And this Victorian lockdown, what are we, 11 weeks in? It's got to lift. And all the remaining restrictions need to go soon. Because we know a lot more about this disease 7 months on, and we know now it's almost exclusively a threat to the very old and the already very sick, who can be protected without throwing our economy into these lockdowns. Now, the weakness in last night's budget was not what it did, which I say was unavoidable in the circumstances, but what it didn't do. There was no new commitment to fossil fuel power stations. There's only one new small dam that I could see, and the legislated increase in superannuation, what we know hits small businesses hard and means workers aren't getting a lift in their real pay. Well, that's not yet been dumped. Most critically for me, though, is that the government looks as though they're passing up the chance to use this current pause in migration to have an honest debate in this country about how big we want our population to be. That we take people in, yes, of course we do. We do take people in, we should. We're a migrant country with a very proud migrant history. But that we do it at a rate that improves and lifts our standard of living and doesn't diminish it. And that we stop letting Treasury officials rely on ever-increasing migration as a lazy way to economic growth. As another American president said in response to another economic slump, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That was perhaps the strongest element in last night's budget. The confidence the government has, that I have, I think most of you have, that this will pass.